Okay, welcome everyone to the second panel in the LCB conference. This panel is on the theme of sustainability in aviation. Sustainability in all its dimensions, be it environmental or social, has become an indispensable question shaping the future of aviation. We can adopt a value chain perspective to this issue from the materials that we use to build aircrafts or other technologies in aviation to the sourcing of these materials, as well as the production practices and processes that govern their use in this industry. And across the entire value chain, we also have the overhanging issues of employee welfare, worker rights, and so forth. So today we'll hear from our panelists on some of the innovations in materials, processes, and practices in this industry. Yet the industry still faces some challenges in meeting some of its sustainability goals. Now, I'm not an expert in aviation, and so when I read the news, on the one hand, you see the rise of low-cost carriers and their implications for sustainability. On the other hand, you see the usage of private jets increasing over the past decades. And while providing accessibility and affordability in their own ways, these issues have drawn attention or lay attention to the sector. So you have issues about ongoing production waste, dependence on conventional energy sources, labor concerns, and so on. So as we gather today, our excellent panelists bring in a wide range of expertise and depth of experience, and we'll be talking with them on what are the innovation solutions that are seen in the sector, making it more sustainable. How do they see the future of aviation evolve, and what role can policymakers, academics, and industry experts play in answering these questions? So with this in mind, let's introduce the panelists we have today. First up, we have Nathalie Herbeles, Vice President, Industry Affairs and Sustainability, Airports Council International, ACI World. So in her role, she's responsible for ACI's strategic engagement with the International Civil Aviation Organization and oversees the development and delivery of ACI World Sustainability Agenda, covering environmental protection, economic policy, and workforce development at airports. She has over 20 years of experience in the sector. Second, we have Dr. Pascal Hubert, Professor of Mechanical Engineering from McGill University. He is also the Werner Group Chair on Sustainable Composites Manufacturing and is also the Associate Director of the McGill Institute for Aerospace Engineering. His research interests mainly focus on the development of next generation of process modeling tools in the development of advanced composite materials. And finally, we have our third panelist, Valerie Myers, Senior Director, Global Supply Chains and Sustainability at CAE. Prior to this, Valerie worked at Arconic Titanium and Engineered Products as the Director of the Program Management Office and has held the position of the Director of the Boeing 787 program at Alcoa Titanium and Engineered Products. Valerie has also held various leadership roles at Pratt & Whitney, Canada, in supply management, including supply quality. Thank you all, everyone. And the way we have structured this panel is upfront, we'll have each of our three panelists provide some opening remarks, and then the opening remarks will set the stage for our panel discussion to follow. We'll also have some time for Q&A, so in case you have any questions, make a note of them, and please keep them for the end. So first up, we'll have Nathalie with her opening remarks. It's your stage.
Good morning, everyone. We will break things up a little bit by using the podium for this panel. I believe I'm the first aviation industry speaker today, so that's a pleasure. I want to thank McGill and the Laidley Center for Business Ethics for inviting me to speak to you today. I also want to congratulate the previous panel on being extremely entertaining. In aviation, we're a system that needs to collaborate to get things done. It's a very complex, fascinating industry, but that means that we tend to speak to each other a lot. Airports, airlines, ANSPs, air traffic controllers, airframe manufacturers. We speak to each other all the time. That's what I do in my role. It's rare that we speak to people outside the sector. So I really relish the fact that we are in events like these that allow for this respectful confrontation of views. I do not see this a lot, and I really look forward to, provocative questions today. I honestly am not facing those a lot in my daily job, and I welcome them. I think these are extremely important for humans to move forward, is to welcome respectful criticism. So the urgency of our sustainability mission in aviation and at airports can't be overstated. Aviation brings people together. It contributes to prosperity. Airports themselves are a gateway to new opportunities, to family reunions, to global exchanges that help make the world a smaller and a better place. But that's not enough, and we are under increasing scrutiny for the impact that we have on the planet and on people. It was mentioned in the first panel, but we are an industry that people love to hate. It is also an industry that people cannot live without. We saw this during the COVID-19 pandemic and in the aftermath of the pandemic, where demand bounced back much faster than many people expected. And we do not see this appetite for flying going away. We are under scrutiny for our impact on the planet and the people, but we are addressing it, and this is my key message to you today, is don't underestimate the amount of work and effort that is happening in the industry to address our impact. We have a duty to address these impacts, and this is the week of COP29, and we are hearing yet again very grim predictions for how the planet is warming quicker than expected, and the fact that everybody must play their part. As aviation, we are united in making strides to decarbonize. All key players in the aviation sector, including ICAO, which represents the governments, and the industry, including my association, Airports Council International, the association that represents airlines, IATA, the international association that represents aircraft manufacturers, air traffic controllers. We've all united around a critical target, and that's to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Do you know a lot of sectors globally that have committed to this target? It's an ambitious goal, and it is a difficult one, because aviation is considered, in the jargon, a hard-to-abate sector. It is a sector for which there are no easy solutions. But I will talk about what we're doing to identify these solutions and reach net zero. ACI, my association, we represent airports. We have over 2,000 members around the world. We were the first association in aviation to commit to reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This will require collaboration at an unprecedented level. It will also require commitment to innovation, to responsibility, and to transparency. So you might be surprised to hear that airports themselves contribute only about 2% of the 2 to 3% of global emissions generated by the entire aviation sector, respective to global emissions generally. This may seem like a small number, but it is significant in many ways, because we are under scrutiny, as I mentioned, and because our operations are growing. We're growing very fast. We expect growth. We expect traffic to double by 2042. So the status quo is simply unacceptable. So airports embrace a significant stewardship role. And I was thinking about it in the context of business ethics. This is not a term, to be honest, that I use in my daily work a lot, but being here today prompted me to reflect on the intersection of business ethics, sustainability, and this morning's discussion prompted me to reflect on the role of profits in all of this. Because we talk about so much more than profit in my work, we talk about doing the right thing. And I wondered why. Airports are capital intensive and very long-term assets, right? You don't build a runway to tear it down in a week. You have to think long-term. This means that immediate profit or revenue is not something that is the main driver for airports. It's long-term results. Airports are also really grounded in their environment, their communities. They're literally set in their environments. So they are closely connected to their communities, their environments, and most of their workers come from there. I would add that the risks of not doing anything, for example, on carbon emissions, are just too high. We would be shooting ourselves in the foot if we were to keep focusing on revenue and money, as was mentioned this morning, while knowing that ultimately this will mean our industry will just be prevented from existing. Because decarbonizing is our license to grow, and we're very clear-eyed about this. So it's a risk to not do anything, and we are actively working on doing something. So it's both a responsibility and an opportunity. The most significant reductions across aviation will actually come, we expect, from fueling airplanes with cleaner energies and from alternative propulsion technologies. We're focusing a lot as a sector, as aviation, on sustainable aviation fuels for the midterm, on electric propulsion for smaller aircraft, and on hydrogen for the bigger aircraft and in the longer term. So it's really a range of solutions as regards energies. But beyond that, airports are leading on a number of initiatives to directly reduce their own emissions. I'm going to mention a few components of how we are looking at progressing in this area. One of the central components for airports and that ACI overall is driving is the Airport Carbon Accreditation Program. This initiative provides a way for airports to assess their emissions, to map them out, to set targets, to achieve results. And that covers a range of emission sources. You may hear about this as Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. Scope 1 are the emissions that the business generates directly. Scope 2 are the ones related to activities related to electricity consumption, for example. And Scope 3 are the emissions that it does not control directly, but that it can influence. And our carbon accreditation process program has different levels, which allows airports to mature and be able to address ultimately all three of those scopes, starting with their own emissions and then working with partners such as airlines to reduce emissions related, for example, to landing and takeoff emissions. Each of these scopes require different strategies, and as airports work towards decarbonization, they're using these frameworks to guide their actions, to benchmark their progress, and to ensure transparency. But our environmental stewardship extends beyond carbon emissions. Airports are mindful of their responsibilities in preserving biodiversity, promoting circularity, and managing noise. I would mention noise in particular because this is where we need to look at how airports, being near residential areas, impact the communities. Effective noise management programs exist at airports. They focus on operational measures, community engagement, and technology upgrades. But this brings to mind as well the impact that our industry has, not just on the planet, on people as well, and our engagement with the communities is key. And this brings me to the social dimension, and what are we doing to foster social sustainability? This has become critical in the post-COVID era. We saw that our workforce left during the pandemic and to a great extent did not fully come back. We saw deep vulnerabilities in the aviation workforce. The Great Resignation led many people to leave the sector, and that in itself led to operational disruptions and delays. And you may remember the summer of 2022, I believe, where the media, again, was particularly focused, and understandably so, on the tremendous impact that the shortage of workers was having on people and their vacation plans, for example. So this is something that was already a concern, but became even more so in the last few years. We need, as a sector, to attract and retain workers across all roles in aviation. We are actively engaged in a global effort to understand and address these challenges. We actually see that we are no longer as attractive and competitive as an employment sector as others. And there are different factors for this. Many people now expect to work from home. It is very difficult to do in many airport operational jobs. Airport jobs entail shifts. You will start at 3 a.m., you will finish late in the evening. Commuting has become more difficult, and people can just find much more comfortable jobs working from their house. We realize that this is a challenge in our industry because we're growing. Are we going to be able to attract as many people as this doubling of traffic in the next 18 years? It's going to be a huge challenge. To some extent, automation is going to help us fill some of the gaps, but we are not at all in a perspective of reducing numbers of workers. Trust me, we're looking at growth regardless. And my hope is that we can actually focus on enhancing the quality of jobs, upskilling, reskilling people so that they can be helped by technology, so that the more manual and tedious tasks of lifting baggage in the rain can be helped, can be assisted by technology, and that our workers can focus on tasks such as customer experience, a topic that was mentioned this morning, and for which we need the face-to-face and the human interaction. So there are opportunities. I would also add that the fact that our sector is under scrutiny, to me, should be an opportunity in terms of attracting and retaining talent. People see that the sector is polluting. I will tell you, if you think that that's the case, join us. Be part of the solution. Don't just complain from outside and keep flying. We need people. So join our industry and help us be part of the solution, because we are working on greening aviation. We're making progress, but we need as much talent as we can have. And I know a lot of you in this room are students, so please spread the word. Our sector needs talent. And I know we have a lot of talent from universities, including McGill University, where I now have my pool of talent to join ACI. Just a word on accessibility, which was mentioned in the first panel. Key initiative for us at Airports Council International, not just because a bunch of people in our headquarters decided that this was the right thing to do, but because our airports want to be more accessible. They want to be getting better and better at accessibility. It's not just the right thing to do. We know that 1 of every 5 people in the world have a disability. Ignoring these people in the equation of travel makes no sense. We also see that they are largely an untapped market. When our airports and the airlines are making travel difficult for people with disability, then we're just not, we're not attracting them to our system. They actually travel less than they might want to. And the world's a beautiful place, and everybody should be able to explore it. So we know that we can and should be doing a lot. We've done a lot. If I can plug a little bit of our activities, we have an accessibility accreditation program where we go out at airports and look at whether they are meeting a certain number of best practices we've established as an international industry. We've learned from best practices from all over the world, and we help airports enhance across different facets, from top management commitment to accessibility, to training, to understanding invisible disabilities, which is an often ignored part of the accessibility equation. We're also working with partners such as ICAO and IATA, and we've reached an ICAO resolution, which we actually led 2 years ago, drafted the first ICAO resolution dedicated to accessibility. We are developing an ICAO strategy on accessibility, and I would invite all of you to sign up to a symposium that will happen early December, around the day of the International Day for Persons with Disabilities, that will be co-organized by IATA, ACI, and ICAO on this topic of accessibility. So trust me when I say that this is not just something we pay lip service to, it's something that people care about. We want to put at the top of the agenda for many, many reasons. In closing, I just want to say that the path to a sustainable and an ethically sound sector is a journey that demands action. It also demands accountability. We're committed to being responsible stewards, not only of our environmental resources, but also for the social well-being of our workforce and our communities and our passengers. In a sector as interconnected as ours, our success depends on collective engagement and shared responsibility. Thank you very much.
Now we'll have Dr. Pascal give his opening remarks.
Thank you very much. So am I the only engineer in the room? Yes, I thought that we were not too many here today. So first I'd like to thank you for the invitation for this event. This is really I watched the first panel. It was really entertaining. And for me, it's a completely different type of event that I'm used to participate. So today I would like to talk to you a bit about the composite materials that are heavily used in aerospace and their sustainability challenges. But before I get to more of the details, I need to maybe explain what they are, because you might not be familiar with these materials. So these are materials that are actually engineered, they are man-made, and they are essentially made out of two components. One is a fiber, like a glass fiber, carbon fiber, and then a glue or a plastic that hold the fiber together. And they can be really tuned to have specific properties, so which means that they are very attractive to make any kinds of applications. And examples of these materials would be carbon fiber with like an epoxy, which is heavily used in aerospace. Compared to metals, essentially they are much stronger than an equivalent mass of metal. So they are much stronger and lighter. So the applications are found everywhere, in every sectors. I think the most obvious one for some of you who practice sport would be like your tennis racket, your hockey stick, your golf clubs, your kayaks, your skis. They all have composite. And you like them because they're performant. You can be better player, maybe, with them. But they're also found in a lot of sectors like construction, energy sector, and also transportation. So, and I'm going to converge towards aviation now. So transportation, we find them in urban mobility, in automotive, especially in high-performance automotives, because they're very expensive. So F1, Formula One, they're all in composite material. So of course, for aerospace, composites are materials of choice. And because of this high performance that they can get you. For making primary and secondary structures. So those are your wings, your fuselage, structures that if they fail, you die. Okay, so they are very critical to the safety of the aircraft. So if you think of modern aircraft today, in 2011, the Boeing 787 was introduced. In 2015, it was the Airbus 350. And more recently, the Airbus 220, formerly the C series, yes, made in Quebec. They all have composite material anywhere between 20 to 50% of their weight, meaning that they are composites everywhere. You get into the fuselage of this aircraft, it's all composite, the wings are composite, and everything is in composite that holds the aircraft together. So why do we like composites for airplane? And you like them too when I'm going to mention some of the advantages. First of all, the obvious one is you're 20% lighter than regular metals. So you can make lighter airplanes. And that has a strong effect on their carbon emission, as I will discuss a little bit. They don't corrode, no corrosion. But that means you can have a nice, humid, environment in the aircraft. It's not as dry as it used to be. On long flights, you don't feel as much, the dryness of the air because we can bump the humidity in the cabin without risking of corroding everything. They do not fatigue like metals. So fatigue is when you, after some hours of operation, you start to develop cracks. I teach solid mechanics, and I always tell students that the aircrafts are full of cracks. Well, that was for metal aircraft, but composite aircraft, they don't fatigue. What that means for you, you can have larger windows. You can have larger doors. We talked about accessibility. Thanks to that, we can make larger cuts in the fuselage thanks to composite material. Also, I don't know if you're like me, but when you fly and you change altitude, it's not so pleasant with your ears, right? Because they pressurize the cabin to a certain level. But with composite, you can pressurize more. So you don't feel as much the effect of changing altitude. So passengers gain by using composite. And lastly, the way we make aircraft, traditionally, we take a bunch of sheet metal, we form them, and then we assemble them with like millions of rivets, fasteners. And it requires a lot of skilled worker, robots now. But with composite, you can actually make these parts in one shot. You don't need as many parts. So that has a lot of advantages in terms of the cost of manufacturing. So what I want to say is that the composite, we like them now in aerospace. And it's going to be really hard not to just say tomorrow, let's forget about them. So in terms of their carbon footprint effect, the composites have found to have a little bit of some impact on the reduction of green gas emissions. So I found that it's around 15% compared to a metallic aircraft. This is by having lighter structures, more durable, and so on. Okay, and these numbers are being approximated, assuming that when the aircraft is reaching its end of service, you just take it and put it in the garbage. So it's even not considering that you could recycle it. So you're you just say, I'm done with this aircraft, I just throw it away. I'm still gonna help in terms of carbon footprint. So they have some advantages, less fuel consumption. So we expect those composites to remain in the material of choice for commercial aircrafts. We talk about business jets. This is not as clear as a commercial, but commercial, then definitely composites will be used. And we expect that because of that, there's going to be a 10% growth rate of use of composite like over the next few years. On top of that, we hear about these all these smaller aircrafts that will be developed for urban mobility. The air taxis. It's a big industry in development right now. We still don't see them flying because it's of regulations. Because of course you need to make sure that they are safe. But eventually there will be a lot of these aircraft, and they're all made out of composite. So what are the problems now? So I actually told you about the good things. It's like I'll make the analogy of the movie, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, now let's get to the ugly part. It's the end of, first one is the end of life challenge. Because we have, we develop these aircrafts, eventually they're going to be retired, okay? And that's true for any aircraft. They can be metallic. We have to retire them. There's various reasons for that. The problem with composites is that they are very hard to recycle. And I would say even almost impossible. Why is that? Well, because the way we make them, we take a fiber, we take a plastic, and we combine it. The plastic and the process that we use to combine them is irreversible. We cannot just take this material, put it back into an oven, remelt it. Think of the aluminum, for example. Your cans that you throw away, they just put it in a furnace and you can recycle them. Plastics, same thing. In theory, we can recycle them. We know we only recycle about 10% because of other issues. But in theory, they can be recycled and reused. These composites that make most of the airframe are not recyclable. You cannot, it's done. Once they are cured, that's it. You're stuck with them. So, what happens to them then? Where do they go? In the landfill. That's what's happening today. Most of the decommissioned composite is ending up in a landfill. We estimate that by 2050, there's going to be 500,000 tons of carbon fiber composite. That's only carbon fiber. I'm not even talking about wind turbine blades, which is even more. They will be generated, and then they will be waste. So it's a very big environmental problem, right? You don't want to throw things away. I mean, I'm very happy when I don't have to put my garbage every week, right? But the other problem with this is that we throw away a very high valuable material. We throw away the carbon fibers that we made. Just to give you an idea about how much energy is wasted there, I'm going to tell you that to make a carbon fiber takes about 6,000% more energy than to make steel. So it's a very high energy demanding process. So if we say, like in 2020, for example, there was about 62,000 tons of carbon fiber landfilled. That represents 53,000 terajoules of energy. How much is that? Who's driving a Tesla here? Tesla 3? Yes? So you can drive 50,000 Tesla for 100 years. That's how much energy we are throwing away. How many aircrafts will be retired? We estimate that over the next 20 years, 20,000 aircraft. And today, like let's say the old generation aircraft that are metallic, 90% of it can be recycled if the cost is justified as well, because you need to dismantle these aircrafts. It's very expensive. But the new generation aircraft, it's only 60 to 70% that can be recyclable today. If you think of the aircraft interior, we are all familiar with it, you know. This is all made in composite material. There's only 70% of it ends up in a landfill today. Why is that? Because the techniques are not efficient and they are expensive. It's all a matter of cost and the technical challenges that is to separate the materials. Now I've talked about the end-of-life issue, but there's another problem with composite. It's how we manufacture them. Generates a lot of waste. So how do we make them? Well, they are made with large pressure oven, if you wish. And we basically take a composite material that comes in the form of a roll, and it's a roll of fibers with the plastic in it. We cut patterns to make the shape that we need. We put these patterns on a mold. We put that into an oven. Now, you cut these patterns from a roll. There's leftover. Think about an analogy with an industry that you all participate in. And you're all dressed up today like nobody's naked here. The fashion industry, which is a really bad industry for environmental issues. It's using the same principle. You buy your textile in a roll, you cut your pattern, and you make your clothes. Well, that's how we make composite, in a nutshell. So all these waste of material represent up to 50% of material waste. So this is not even material that is not good. It's fresh material that we just throw away. And I'm not even talking about the other materials used to make the composite materials that are also not recyclable. So in summary, our industry, the aerospace composite industry, is based on a linear economy model, clearly. Like you just get the material that is most likely made from synthetic. Well, they use oil as a base material. We use it and then we dispose it. Clearly, this has to change. So I wanted to set the stage about the problem, but I would be happy. I know we'll have a discussion about what is done to change that, because I'm putting a portrait that looks a bit glim, you know, not very exciting, but I wanted to tell you what was the facts of today's technology, and I will be happy to discuss about what's done to improve that, but that will be through our discussion, I believe. So I'm going to stop here so that we can hear from the next panelist. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pascal. Now we'll hear from our third panelist, Valerie.
And I had not prepared for bringing the audience back up after this very sobering conversation about composites, and I'm a consumer of composites in my job. I was feeling guilty. Like the numbers were entertaining, interesting, and then I started feeling like a weight on my shoulders. I was going to say good morning, but I think it's the afternoon. So very, very thrilled to be here sharing the stage with my peers in the industry. A big thank you to the Laidley Center for inviting me, and for my friend John Gradick for volunteering me into the event today. All right, I might improvise a little bit just to lighten the mood after the very sobering conversation of composites. So in 2021, at the IATA's 77th meeting, the aerospace industry took a stance on global emissions and committed to net zero. Natalie mentioned it earlier. ICAO members followed suit shortly thereafter. 3 years later, in 2024, we're finding that aviation airlines as well as aircraft producers, whether it's aircraft or systems that support these aircraft, had committed to science-based targets. Who's familiar with that? SBTI? Oh, good, I have something to share. Of course you would be. So the targets are deemed to be based in science if they are in line with the latest climate science that is deemed necessary to meet the Paris Accord agreement. You can easily see that this is going to be a moving target, right? None of the industries are moving fast enough in order to get to net zero by 2050, right? Now, as of September 2024, there were 16 airlines that had such targets. So this is committed in their annual reports. It's public. It's out there. They've got to do something about it. 16 airlines, that doesn't seem like much, but consider some of the names. Air France, American Airlines, China Airlines, Delta, KLM, Lufthansa, and United Airlines, just to name a few. At the same time, 12 OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, had also made these types of commitments. 12 doesn't seem like a whole lot, but that is the critical mass of the entire industry. It includes people like Airbus. It includes big names, tier ones, such as GKN, Safran, and Thales, and also a couple, only two, in North America for now, which includes CE, the company I represent. So these are very large organizations with very large supply chains. So the question that was posed of me is, why are we thinking about sustainability in supply chains? I'm going to get to it. I'm building up on it. So really, as all of these players, large actors in the industry, are making public commitments, they have to develop a plan. And that has to include their entire value chain. That has to include their suppliers. Actually, out of the 12 OEMs that committed to science-based targets, there's a full third of them that made commitments that include supplier targets. That means they're looking at the vast tranche of their suppliers and saying, you're going to commit also. That's peer pressure. So industry peer pressure, as Natalie indicated earlier, we do talk, we also move together in this industry, for better or for worse. So what does it mean? It means that both the airlines and the OEMs are looking across all of their activity and pinpointing certain areas of their activity in order to decarbonize their value chain. They have to decarbonize it by over 2/3 by 2050. Imagine cutting your budget by over 2/3. So the status quo is not going to solve, cannot solve, and it's got to change very quickly. So the typical responses are to panic, because you don't know where to start. That was kind of my reflex 2 years ago when I took on the sustainability. I added that to my title. The other typical response is to kind of ignore it and think, well, we're just going to bank on new technologies, on sustainable aviation fuel, SAF for short. But really, the reality, look in the room here, is that the general public, airlines, other customers, other large players in the industry, governments, some, not all, associations are all moving towards that and are telling us all it's everyone's problem. So we do have to take note. Let's get back to the emissions. Natalie mentioned earlier that the aerospace sector only contributes 2.5 to 3%. That excludes what Professor Hubert was alluding to earlier, the end of life of the products. So it excludes what do we do with engines or with aircraft or other assets when they're no longer fit for use. But we'll park that. So when you decompose those emissions, about 80%, there's a range there, so don't quote me on this, but about 80% is believed to stem from flights, burning fuel. That's a lot. That's a lot. And then there's airport activity, and then there's supply chain. So the supply chain that underpins the industry. It's deemed to be about 10 to 15%. 10 to 15%, that's not a whole lot. What's the payback? Why would we bother? Well, we know how evolutive aerospace technology is for a main reason, safety. The next panel will talk about that at length. So technological step changes are very incremental, they are deliberate, and they're cautiously rolled out and bank on existing technologies in aerospace. It's a very conservative sector. That's why we're typically dressed in blue or black. Kind of like finance. So aircraft propulsion that will have a lesser reliance on fossil fuels or burn them much more efficiently to reach those targets is not going to happen anytime soon. So while airlines and OEMs alike are banking on greener technologies, from propulsion to aircraft design to sustainable aviation fuels or the likes, the reality is twofold. these will not pay dividends in the years to come, and in some cases, even the decades to come. This is not tomorrow. And the other reality is that the vast supply chain that underpins the industry does contribute emissions. We go back to SAF. So by some estimates, SAF is assumed to provide, and I'm not sure why the range is so big, but maybe there's somebody smart that might be able to explain this if we have time, between 24 to 70% of emissions reductions by 2050, not in 5 years. So that's not 100% of the emissions from the aerospace sector. And it's not anytime soon either. We know of the limitations of SAF in terms of its availability and the prohibitive costs. So cleaner technologies, highly efficient propulsion systems, or aircraft designs, or SAF, are not the panacea of the ills of today, nor will they be for the foreseeable future. So our answer at CAE, my answer, is to address every node in your value chain and take care, if you can, at least of the low-hanging fruit, namely composites. I'm going to check that box. So but we're not just stopping at addressing emissions. There are other considerations, such as human rights. We talked about that earlier. So that brings me to the IAEG. We've been throwing a lot of acronyms here today. That's the International Aerospace Environmental Group, which was started by Boeing and Airbus, and a few other tier ones joined. There's about 60 members now. Again, 60 may not seem like a lot. These are all of the big actors that move the industry forward. The association was founded, so this is not for profit, and it was founded with a vision to develop voluntary, leading-edge solutions across the value chain to promote a responsible and sustainable aerospace industry. It doesn't single out SAF or greener engines. It's all nodes of the value chain. The group adopted nearly 2 years ago EcoVadis as its platform for members and their suppliers to assess the maturity of their business practices on 4 elements. I feel bad, some of you guys are behind the post there. So these 4 are environmental management, evidently, human rights and labor, ethics and governance, and can you guess what the 4th one is? Supply chain, sustainable supply chain. Guess which one scored the lowest across every single member? Supply chain. So we did our own assessment last year. We encourage our key suppliers to do the same thing, not to evaluate and slap anybody on the hand, but really to baseline where are we at, take stock, and then progress forward from there. Remember the list of the airlines and the OEMs that I listed earlier that have submitted to sustainability and decarbonization targets. Well, guess what? They expect us to progress and move rapidly. So if that 10%, regardless of what I've just said in the last few minutes, if that 10% is only emitted by, supply chains, really, I don't know, if you have the privilege like I to work in supply management, or you yourself are a supplier, you might be thinking, why bother? Let's hang our hats on technology, on greener technologies. Why would we invest? Well, let's flip the question a little bit on its head. Why would we invest in enhancing the competitiveness and the productivity of the Canadian aerospace industry? Wait a minute, we thought we were talking about ethics and sustainability in aviation. So what's the link here? Okay, I'll quote somebody famous, a scholar, I guess. Every action has a reaction. So when you're producing something, you're causing certain actions, you are utilizing certain resources, be it people, be it fuels or other forms of energy, through your facilities, through your capital assets. You're consuming some materials, raw materials, be them natural or man-made, like composites. So as you are consuming these resources, you might be generating benefits. Great, jobs, revenues, maybe even profits. But every time you do that, there are costs that are underlying, right? So that means every action generates costs, which generates forms of waste, such as coupons of composites. That's really stuck with me. And therefore generates emissions. So there is a perfect correlation, maybe not perfect, but there's a very close correlation between cost management, productivity, and waste management, emissions. Canada is seriously lagging in its productivity growth. I mean, it's actually shameful. Our productivity, which of course, as you know, productivity enables a population to raise its standard of living, but when you look at it from a sectorial standpoint, it enables that sector to defend its competitiveness, to grow its competitiveness and attractiveness on a global scale. Ours in Canada shrank by 0.6% in the last 5 years, compared to a growth of 10% to our neighbors down south in the US, and I won't even name some of the other countries that have been far excelling these rates. So the industrial sector in general, not just aerospace, but aerospace is certainly included in there, is woefully lacking momentum to improve productivity. We see the impetus of better environmental stewardship, more sustainable practices as a vector of change, and embracing it so that it is also a productivity enabler. Basically, what we tell our suppliers is, if it's bad for you, bad for your business, eradicate it. If it doesn't add any value, stop doing it. It's bad for your bottom line, it's bad for your stakeholders, it's bad for the environment. As an OEM, and in my role in particular, we endorse our responsibility towards steering really our supply chain, our whole value chain for that matter, toward greater competitiveness and more sustainable practices. Sustainability cannot sit solely on the shoulders of the CSO, the Chief Sustainability Officer. It would be a very, very lonely place. So that's why we embedded sustainability within our supply management strategy, within our supply management operating model. When you think of it, suppliers for decades had a really straightforward, but nevertheless challenging job: deliver. Deliver on cost, deliver on quality, deliver on time. But now the world demands greater levels of responsibility from all producers, big and small. So to drive behavioral change, this is a paradigm shift. This is not business as usual, right? We needed a system. Our system hinges on 4 key components. We start with values. Who likes to be told what to do? Even at our age, like, don't tell me what to do. Tell me why. Why are we doing this? So we align with our suppliers and talk about the purpose, our mission, where we're going, why we're doing this, and why they can benefit too. We work on the issues on their turf with them as well. Then we set up our foundational pillars. That's kind of our North Star. So for us, it's ecosystems. We're not going to do this alone. We're not going to do this with 2 or 3 suppliers. It is the entire ecosystem that has to start using the same language, the same jargon, and start moving forward together, which we are. And of course, the big muscle movement in a supply chain is decarbonization. So we wanted to make that a key pillar in our strategy. And governance, hold ourselves accountable and figure out what are we trying to do in 2 years, 5 years, 20 years out. Secondly, or thirdly rather, invest in engagement and mobilization. Sending a mere memo to suppliers and saying, here's what I expect of you, and I expect it next week, not going to happen. So it's fostering dialogue, it's enhancing understanding, sensitizing, and really a two-way dialogue so we understand where they have some pain points, and lo and behold, we can actually take cost, take waste, lower emissions down, and act more sustainably together. And lastly, we frame our efforts through our supplier performance program. We don't believe in a two-dimensional system that merely measures outputs, on-time delivery or EPPM. We believe in behaviors, in supporting and driving behaviors that will actually lead to the desired outputs. So it's a values-based system, 50% for operational performance, 50% for sustainability. That's a strong message. It caused many of our suppliers to say, oh, well, how do I do this? Well, we partner with them and we work on it together. Fundamentally, my belief is that those organizations that will figure out how to conduct business more sustainably, creatively, will end up on top. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we'll move on to the discussion stage of the panel. We'll first begin with you, Natalie. So in your opening remarks, You talked about how airports face a variety of sustainability challenges. So it's not just emissions, but you have maintaining good relations with the community, noise management, and Valerie, you too bring up these issues in the context of supply chains of OEMs. Now, what I'm then interested in is in knowing how do airports or OEMs for that matter, how do they figure out a way to prioritize these different dimensions? And what drives them to focus on a few dimensions rather than the others? And I suppose underlying this question is also the issue of cost, right? How do these airports prioritize these different issues, keeping the cost consideration in mind?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I don't think it's going to be the same answer for every business and every company and every sector. I think at the end of the day, these very often are trade-offs. You can address the social element, and this will have an impact on the environmental dimension, or your economic sustainability will have an impact on social and environmental. At the end of the day, it's a tricky but very important thought process that needs to happen at every airport, and we encourage them to develop their own sustainability strategies that consider their own context, where they're located, what their goals are, what their values, what their mission are, what their priorities are, and that certainly drives it. We're also engaged in promoting ESG because we see that increasingly financing institutions require reporting on sustainability metrics, and ESG is becoming something that airports cannot ignore. In some regions, this is actually regulated, but what we wanted to do is to provide a framework for airports to establish those metrics and provide the reporting. So we developed something that is specific to airports, an ESG framework for airports that is going to be launched officially early next year. That will provide airports with a tool that they can use if they wish to do so, to identify what are the specific airport dimensions of sustainability that they can decide to focus on. Because airports are, unique businesses. Again, they're infrastructure and they're a part of the aviation sector. And we wanted to identify again what are the community-related elements that we're grappling with. What are the environmental types of data that airports need to start collecting, and the governance related ones as well. So I would also say that when it comes to ESG, we're facing in some parts of the world an uphill battle. We're the anti-ESG calls in the US and the recent elections are a cause for concern in that regard. And I think the aviation industry wants to move forward. I guess the whole aviation industry, but it's going to be a interesting next few years, seeing how the calls for anti-ESG regulation are progressing.
Thank you. And Valerie, the same question to you, maybe from an OEM's perspective. And I also found it interesting that Natalie mentions the role that investor pressure plays in getting these airports to focus on, let's say, one dimension or the other, driven by their reporting requirements. So if you look at the 3 drivers or 4 drivers of ESG initiatives, maybe government regulations, you have consumer pressure, you have investor pressure, and maybe employee pressure to some extent in at least some industries. Do you have any views on what are sort of the dominant forces influencing companies to push in one direction or the other?
Well, they change constantly, right? And you can look to the left and you'll see a certain type of pressure or an opinion, and you'll look to the right and you'll see something else. So I think as an organization, as a corporation, what we have done at any rate is be very clear with ourselves and create a cohesive system. So what I mean by that is there's a corporate level strategy. What is our sustainability agenda? Why are we doing certain things and why are we not doing other things? You can't do it all. So you have to really be consistent with yourself and form something that's homogeneous. you know what I mean. And where supply management is concerned, that's what we did. So we really shaped our own strategy to be in line with the corporate strategy. The last thing that we wanted was to just launch, you know, hodgepodge kind of projects here and there that looked green, and obviously expose ourselves to accusations of greenwashing and just, again, not being consistent with ourselves. So that's why we set our own framework. We revisit it, but for the most part, it stays fairly static. Again, I indicated earlier, decarbonization is a big one. We consume over 3,000 pounds of composites on a flight simulator. I should have a paper bag. And of course, metals, electronics, all sorts of, you know, things on our products. So we knew that that was the big heavy lifting, and we needed to engage with our suppliers very rapidly, but also with our engineering. Again, it's a whole system. Why engineering? Well, if we design it this way, guess what? This is what we're going to consume in terms of raw materials. That's the fabrication process that we're directly or indirectly dictating, and we result with certain specific emissions. So it's really based on the corporate strategy and a framework, and again, being true to yourself and consistent.
Perfect, thank you. And Pascal, so you gave the analogy of the good, bad, and the ugly, and you left your own movie at a cliffhanger in some sense. So maybe, you know, so the growing adoption of advanced composites is, I suppose, good news. Hopefully that's where you're going with this. But you draw attention to two sources of waste, right? One is the downstream end-of-life waste. The other is the upstream waste as well in manufacturing these composites. And I see some parallels to other industries like the solar industry and the wind turbine industry, where again you have similar news reports of end-of-life disposal issues and of solar panels or wind turbines. To what extent do you think these problems are analogous? Are there, what are the solutions out there? Is there a more hopeful case that you can present?
Of course. Yeah, so, does it work? Yeah. So yeah, they are very similar. I mean, we all face the same issues. What will be different maybe will be the type of materials used and the cost and the economic value of what you waste, right? A carbon fiber is more expensive than a glass fiber, so. But there are a lot of efforts to try to deal with this. And the first one is to repurpose, you know, your structures. Instead of throwing them away, you use them almost as is for other applications. So we can see wind turbines being used in outdoor architectural design. You could actually, if you want, get a piece of a fuselage and make a cabin or something like that. You could do that kind of thing, and then you don't need to throw it away. But the most, I would say, efforts are trying really to, for specific materials, again, the ones that we see more in airframes and wings today, is to try to extract the high-value material that you dispose, and it's the fiber. So everything is done to try to extract the fibers and then use it to make new materials with it. And that, there's been a lot of work. There are companies that are doing that. Boeing is actually sending their scrap to a company that will extract the fibers, and then this fiber can then be used to make other products. And that's called revalorization. And so we do that, and there are business around that. The issue here is, of course, you're not going to make the same product with the recycled material. You're not going to make an aircraft wing with a recycled carbon fiber. Forget it. But it can be used to make another product that doesn't need as much properties or performance. You can make a skateboard out of a recycled carbon fiber, no problem. So that's one promising solution. There's companies that do that. In terms of manufacturing waste, there are also companies that are using those to make new products. There's a company in France. They take scrap from manufacturing from Airbus, and they make a material that is used in watch. What do? They add a little bit of gold to it, and it's kind of a super luxury material for high-value applications. So there are ways to do that. Of course, there's always challenges with the cost of the material. I heard recently something, I don't know if you heard that in the news, like You know, the shingles that we use in our roof, they're made out of asphalt. Most of them, it's petroleum, right? But there are companies that can recycle it to make asphalt for road. Well, and the best thing is at the same cost as the asphalt to make the road. But then you talk to some people who do asphalt road and they said, I prefer to get the new material rather than the recycled material. It's the same performance, same cost, but one has the etiquette, right, recycled. It's not as good as the new one. So there's a lot of things that we need to change in our way that we think of this. But there are a lot of solutions that are implemented. But again, at the end of the day, it's an issue of cost. And
Is there a role, do you think, for regulators to step in terms of maybe some policy incentives or so forth?
Definitely. I mean, if you let people do what they want, nothing is going to get done, right? So there's a lot. I mean, there's a big problem right now is, there's not enough regulation. A few years ago, I had a chance to go to a G7 summit of the environmental minister, and I was listening to those big companies like the Walmart and the IKEA and trying to deal with these issues of recycling of their materials and products. And I think you need legislation to help, and they are in place. I think I'm not too familiar with this. I did a bit of research, but I found that, of course, the EU are always ahead of everybody in terms of those regulations. So there are regulations trying to limit the amount of composite material that you can landfill, and they set like targets, a certain amount. Some of them are kind of easy to get around, right? They say, if it costs you more than 200 euros per ton to recycle, you can landfill. Well, so it's sometimes not ideal, but there's a lot of efforts to put in place. There are some regulations dealing with hazardous materials in different products that you have to comply to if you want to, for example, use a material in certain countries. So there's a lot of efforts now, but you need that. Otherwise, it's not going to happen, I think.
Thank you. And Valerie, any experience at CAE with dealing with composites? Any policies you have around the waste problem?
Yes, actually, we through some of these initiatives and just taking stock of what we do, what we're consuming, what is the biggest contributors of emissions, and where the sources are, et cetera. Just getting educated and better grounded, as you're doing with us today here. We engage with many of our smaller, medium enterprises, certainly locally. And there was an example on composites specifically where just, you approach a problem intelligently and collaboratively and you end up solving a bunch of problems. So there was major capacity constraints, as Natalie indicated earlier. Planes took back to the skies very aggressively, and guess what? In addition to a lot of the aerospace talent that had migrated away from the industry, many pilots had retired during the pandemic. And so when the airlines felt the demand from the public to take back to the skies, there was a shortage of pilots. So all of a sudden, we had to ramp up our production 4x in just about less than a year. So this was a constraint for many of our suppliers, and composites, at least the process that was utilized on our parts, was extremely manually intensive. Do you think it's enjoyable to wear a hazard material suit, a mask, and shoot this material on a shape, the mold, in order to make our parts? When I learned that, I actually started feeling guilty again. I need therapy, composite therapy. but it really educated me to, okay, now I understand what the issue is. You can't hire people because they just walk over the street and go to Walmart or McDonald's they'd rather work there than this. And so looking at that, looking at the cost, part of resin is petrol. Guess what was happening with the cost of petrol during the pandemic? So there was tremendous cost pressures, tremendous capacity pressures. And then, of course, we're realizing we're throwing a lot of this stuff. It's not recyclable. There's a shortage of the raw materials themselves, etc. Fast forward, it took about 18 months, but we converted all of our molds, so the tools that fabricate these parts, in a different, more efficient manner that now doesn't require hazmat suits and masks, and the resin is infused, so the waste of the raw material went down by over 30%, because you're really just using all of the resins you need to make your shape, as opposed to shooting it all over and having fallout. Additionally, as they were looking at all of the parts, we realized that inside one of the major structural components, very large, kind of mimics the cockpit of a plane, if you will, we were utilizing an exotic wood. I'm really not feeling very good about my job here. We were using an exotic wood as kind of a filler to be part of the structure. Well, again, the engineering team went to work and found a way to use a product that was consuming, get this, over 6,000, little plastic bottles. So that material was consuming about 6,000 plastic bottles to replace this wood that was being sourced from Brazil or somewhere in the Amazon forest. So just a lot of good, and you know what happened? The capacity issue went away. Some of the cost pressures obviously abated. They didn't go away, but they abated at least. But mostly, people were more educated and engaged. They felt they did something cool and that actually contributed to good things, not just making a part.
Thank you. That's sort of, I'm mindful of the time, but I think I can sneak in one more question before I open it up for Q&A. Natalie, that's sort of what Valerie just said lends itself well to an earlier remark that you had made, which is that when you're looking at airports, talent retention is a big part of the puzzle that they have to solve, and that airports observe, and this is not just true, I suppose, in the aviation industry, across industry sectors, people observe that meaningful work is tied to talent retention, right? Now, do you think this is generational? Is this stable? Is this a fad that's going to disappear in some time? If this is here to stay, then what are airports doing to sort of address that part of the puzzle?
Yeah, I absolutely think that finding meaning in your work is something that is critical now, that people demand more than ever, and I do not think it's going to go away, personally. It is partly generational, but I don't think it's only generational. We do know from studies that the younger generations need to identify with the vision and the values of the organization they're joining. But I do think that after the pandemic, there was also a lot of rethink among any generation about what makes you go to work, because we were not going to work for a while, and that's why partly in aviation we've struggled. We've had to think again about what makes it attractive. It's not just a job that people find and then we take it for granted that they work in aviation and you're so lucky you're so lucky we hired you. It became much more, we had to really challenge ourselves. Oh my God, people are not coming back. We may not be doing such a great job at, promoting our industry. And we have to learn the lessons. And I think, I'm an optimist, so I would say we're doing so much. We need to communicate what we're doing, because I do think people want meaning and purpose in their jobs more than ever. The young generations do. So we need to articulate what makes aviation jobs extremely cool. And I do think it's cool because I've been in this industry all my life. It's international, it's fast-paced, it's innovative, and we are, at the cutting edge of a lot of stuff. Sometimes we have big issues, let's face it, where there are horror stories in the news, and we need to take a good, hard look at it and improve. But I do think, again, in both cases, it's a great cause for young people to join us, be part of the solution, join us to make aviation, to keep aviation the great industry that it was, that I think still is, but we have a lot of work to do. I would mention that we are active, and we're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. Something that is mentioned in the aviation sector quite often, but for which we don't have a clear view for airports. How diverse, how inclusive are airports? We often hear about the proportion of pilots that are women. I was surprised to hear this morning someone saying, oh, aviation is I think it was Professor Correa, saying, oh, aviation doesn't have a problem, it's super diverse. Yeah, it's geographically diverse. You need people who speak multiple languages. But first of all, that doesn't mean you're inclusive as an industry, that you give an equal voice to all these diverse talents. And also, I think, when it comes to other dimensions of diversity, people with disabilities, women, underrepresented populations, we can do a better job. So we are studying, actually, the global picture of diversity. And again, I hope that anti-DEI calls in some parts of the world will not make this job harder. But all not to say, yeah, that's going to be key for the future.
Thank you so much. Now we have some time for some audience Q&A. Please feel free to head over to the mics and...
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the very informative presentations. My name is Marc Rioux. I'm an adjunct research professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University, where I teach a master's course in aviation policy. So IATA and ICAO have set the goal of net zero emissions by 2050. There are various pathways to get there. One is operational improvements, although this is seen as having a minimal impact at the end of the day compared to the other possible pathways. One is operational improvements, technological improvements. We've made great strides in this area in the last 30 years, but looking forward, I think the feeling is that it's not going to make the same, the improvements will be much slower because we need radical new designs and engines and aircraft, and it will take time to develop, certify, and produce that new technology in large enough numbers to have an impact. The big one is new sources of energy like SAF, eSAF, hydrogen. Again, the issue is producing these new forms of energy at in large enough quantities to replace jet fuel by 2050. And so, in the meantime, so the air transport industry emits 2.5% roughly of man-made emissions, CO2 emissions today. A lot of experts predict this to go up to perhaps as high as 22% by 2050. Because it's difficult to decarbonize air transport, but also because other modes of transport, especially surface transportation, will be able to make quicker gains and decarbonize quicker. So the spotlight on air transport will become brighter and brighter, along with the political pressure. The only other pathway I can think of, and this one, on the one hand, has a very strong ethical component or underpinning for a lot of people, but it's also taboo, certainly in ICAO and IATA circles, and is what I call demand suppression. So emit less by flying less. So my question to Valérie and Nathalie would be, from your vantage point, what do you think demand suppression would mean for the industry's ability to meet the target of net zero by 2050?
Loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't quite hear your question, but I heard demand suppression, and I wrote that down because I demand suppression. Maybe I can talk about that, or do you want to clarify the question exactly?
Yeah. So, what does it mean for the industry's ability to meet the target of net zero by 2050?
What does demand suppression mean? Okay. Well, so I think there are schools of thought, right? And I'm here again in the context of being open to different thoughts, and I enjoy provocative questions. Should we go in the direction of demand suppression? I've heard about quotas and people suggesting people are only allowed to fly 4 times a year, and that's their maximum. I would say, from my side, be very careful about ideas like this. We live in a world that is, moving forward in so many ways. When you're suppressing a demand that people have, you're suppressing a lot of other things. And aviation does more than just provide a flight to a tourist to an all-inclusive resort, even though that has value, it has value for the local communities in those developing countries that badly need tourism. Aviation, we see a catalyst impact of aviation on, as in terms of jobs, in terms of economic results, and also just in terms of making the world understand, each other better. So I think it's a bit reductive of people to suggest that we should limit flights, per person. But it is definitely, something that is coming up. I would say we would probably do more harm than good in doing this. And I do think we can look more proactively at how aviation can address its emissions, continue to provide the value it does to the world. And let's not forget, for developing countries, it's a huge part of the prosperity that they aspire to and that they have the right to get. They have the right to get richer. We see things from our own privileged standpoint, but they are the part of the world where the demand is coming from is developing countries. So do you want to suppress, if you suppress demand, you actually are largely suppressing it for those developing countries who have the same right to develop as the developed nations have had.
Thank you. I completely agree, but I would add maybe just as more of a counter, as opposed to suppression, is more encouraging not only regulatory bodies, but certainly government to invest in greener technologies. It is extremely capital intensive to develop these and progress these technologies so that we are able to more significantly reduce emissions and contribute to the problem. And funding is very, very much necessary.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Sorry, just a backstory. So this morning I sat down in a wrong conference. So I missed the entertaining first panelist. I happened to sat down in the finance industry role to climate change. So there they were talking about, we have a lot of proofs about climate change, but why is it not so convincing enough? And then they're talking about jargon words like climate disclosure. So I guess my question is more to Valerie, because you mentioned that there are 12 airlines, if I got it right, and 10 OEMs who are on board to commit to decarbonization and sustainability. So I guess my question would be, what are we doing to get more people on board on this, I would say, advocacy?
It's a good question. So it's 16 airlines and 12 OEMs. That was as of a few months ago, and that's just the aerospace industry. That's not other industries, of course. I think in the world of finance, they're looking at risk differently, right? Returns on profit, returns on investment. Sorry, so the profit. So returns on investment, and they're looking at how are corporations handling and addressing and identifying inherent risk in their business, be it whatever. And so, of course, climate change in and of itself can be a significant risk for certain businesses. Think of land erosion, think of tremendous disruptions from major weather events that are increasing exponentially. So that's kind of what they're looking at. So it's related, but a little bit different than what the industry is trying to do, specifically in terms of emissions. Obviously, reduction in emissions should reduce the effects of that we're seeing in climate change. I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember. There was a couple of components in your question. So really, to increase and accelerate, it is exactly that. It's more of this awareness, industry advocacy. There's some peer pressure going on, and as some of these first actors, so 16 plus 12. These are large order givers. So they are going to dictate to their suppliers. That's not just one or two suppliers. They have hundreds, each of themselves. And it's a whole chain effect. So it is starting to trickle down. I'll give an example. About a year ago, if I remember correctly, I'm looking at my colleague here, Airbus indicated to not just us, but all of its potential suppliers, you cannot bid You cannot bid, not even let alone supply me with something. You cannot bid if you don't have X, Y, Z. So they are starting to make this a commercial requirement, an expectation, and eventually, very soon, I think we're going to start seeing this creep into contracts.
Perfect. Yeah, we have time for one more question. Just one.
Oh, I'm so sorry. You were up first. My name is Wing. I'm going to keep it very quick. I just want to ask a very general question about how do you think we as an industry has accepted a lot of the norms, such as the emissions and whatnot, and we're addressing and tackling a problem by the way of reactive measures? And do you foresee anything in a radical change that Dr. Marr have alluded to, that our industry should maybe perhaps look at things in a different way, so such as in project management, you would try to mitigate a risk instead of addressing a risk. What are your thoughts in this field, especially with a 2050 quote-unquote deadline?
Well, again, my perspective, which is trying to make designs that are more eco-friendly, and that's been an effort of a lot of work now. It's to try to develop materials that are easier to recycle, so you don't have to deal with the problems of today's material. So they exist. We do them in my lab. You can come and see. We can make materials that can be recycled. But what is a challenge, as I think it was mentioned, is that in order for an aircraft to fly, it has to be certified. And for that, it has to be, you need a large amount of tests to show that the materials is strong enough. And it requires major investments to do these tests. And so the Airbus and the Boeing, when they have a material for their aircraft, they want to stick with it for many, many years. They don't want to change next year. So unless there's going to be like a real push to do that, and that's going to be a mandate that your designs have to be eco-responsible, and I think we see that. I think there's some policies there that are in place. It's going to take some time to happen, but it might take several years. But there are efforts to do that.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, everyone. I know that there are some questions still floating around, but please hold on to them. And you can maybe ask our panelists those questions over lunch. A big thank you to our three panelists for sharing their time, their expertise, and experience with us today. It's inspiring to see the strides being made in this sector towards sustainability. And with that, we'll close this session. I know I've kept you all from lunch, so if not, if Lindsay doesn't have anything to add, we'll break for lunch now. Okay, thank you.